The necklace, Crank said, ignoring Izuku, causing the woman to shake her head. Give it to me or you're the one who dies. Izuku felt hopeless. Was this what heroes faced daily? He wasn't ready for this. He needed more time, more training, more knowledge, more power. Izuku felt his chakra surge beneath his skin and it began to emanate off of him in waves. The woman and Gear noticed it almost immediately, but Crank was the last to realize it. Idly, Izuku noticed that his chakra wasn't the usual bright blue. It was purple. Crank fired a bullet at him, but Izuku felt something burst from his hand before he used it to slap something aside. It was only when he heard a windshield crack behind him that he realized that he had slapped a bullet aside. Izuku looked at his hand and he saw a strange metal rod sticking out of his palm. It didn't hurt or anything, but it did feel like he had to take it out. The woman's eyes were screwed shut momentarily and Izuku saw that Crank had dropped his gun out of fear. He pointed his hand at Crank and threw no thought of his own. The rod was fired from his hand before slamming into Crank's stomach. The impact was enough to floor the rather well-built man. The second rod was fired, but this one pegged onto Crank's shirt and pulled the criminal along before slamming him into the metal cabinet. The rod was buried deeply into the cabinet and Crank hung from it by shirt like a puppet with his strings cut. He was unconscious. Izuku realized that Crank must have hit his head on the metal cabinet. Ouch. That wasn't important, though. Izuku substituted with the motorcycle from before and picked up the first rod. It was warm. Gear, in contrast to Crank, was overweight and lacked any sort of coordination. The man also seemed exhausted from using whatever sound muffling quirk he had, and that made him easy pickings for Izuku. Before he could do anything, though, Gear collapsed to the floor half exhausted and half scared out of his mind. Please don't hurt me, Gear said as he laid in the trash on the floor. I'm not even violent, I swear. Izuku heard a snort and he saw that the woman was watching him rather intently now. She appeared a bit worse for wear but was ultimately uninjured. That was good news. Izuku ripped off Gear's jacket before using it to tie the man's arms behind him. He removed the strange rod keeping Crank suspended before using his jacket to do the same. He then tied the two of them together for good measure before turning to the woman. Call Kamui Woods. His agency is the nearest to here. Are you okay? Izuku said, and the woman nodded as she typed rapidly into her phone, sending an SOS to said agency. They stared at each other in silence for a fair while. The woman had purple hair and red eyes that seemed to glow unnaturally underneath the moonlight. Yes, I am, the woman said, sagging in relief, thanks to you. You, what? Izuku stuttered and the distortion on his voice made it all the worse. I don't deserve that. I almost got you killed. Things would have been a lot worse if you weren't here, the woman said before rising to her feet and walking right up to him. What agency do you work for? A agency? Izuku's mind blanked underneath the woman's stare. Best Genists. That sounded like a question. I don't work for an agency, Izuku said, finally causing the woman to nod. I was in the area and heard these guys giving you trouble. I'm not licensed, but I could not stand by and let that happen. Thank you, the woman said, her eyes boring into Izuku. Did she not need to blink? All of a sudden, he was pulled into a hug. Izuku was frozen solid as the woman held onto him tightly. You may not be a hero, but you are my hero, the woman said, stepping back. Do you have a name? The White Mask. That still sounds like a question, the woman said, but before Izuku could respond the sound of sirens reached their ears. You should go now. Unless you want to be sent to prison. All right. Izuku said, and he was about to beat it when the woman called out to him again. Any inspirational words for your newest fan? Or maybe an explanation? I did what I had to do, Izuku said, adjusting his stance and feeling the metal rods shift from their position tucked against his waistband. He had to put those in his bag. His fingerprints were all over it. Because that's what heroes do. Izuku had fled into the darkness of the night as he heard the police cars turn the final corner. He dropped his transformation and he weaved through the alleys of Musudafu, eventually coming out on a busy street. It was a weekday, but still, people were out and about. Izuku kept his head down as he bobbed and weaved through the crowds. The smell of food, sweat and alcohol wafted through the air, only serving to make him antsy. The police would be looking for someone a lot taller and bigger than him, but he still felt some trepidation. What if someone had followed him this? What if they saw him drop his transformation? They could have recognized him from any of the Konoha specials floating around, and the police would be at his home before he was. Izuku left the populated area as he took a shortcut through the alleys. Normally, this wasn't an option at night, but right now he was all out of options. The rods he had created from seemingly nothing were in his bag with his scroll, and they made loud clanging noises as he ran through the dark and empty alleys. He got out near his house and he sped down the street, only slowing down when he saw no officers or pros outside the apartment building. He climbed up the steps two at a time before entering his flat in a hurry. His mother was glued to the TV and he froze as he saw what was showing on the TV. "We have never heard of this Takoba Beach vigilante, but he will be apprehended," said Kamui Woods, his tone cool and harsh. "Is that really fair to him?" The reporter said, shoving a mic to Kamui's face. "It is safe to say that if it were not for him, the victim, Ms. Sumire Yutsusu, would not be up and about. Reportedly, you only happened upon her because the vigilante was there in the first place to subdue the criminals. That may be true. However, all heroes must be licensed," Kamui said with an edge to his tone. "It will not always go so smoothly if a civilian intervenes." How smoothly would it have gone if the vigilante had not intervened? Kamui seemed to glare at the rather insipid reporter before turning away. "That's enough questions. I have work to do." "There you have it, ladies and gentlemen," the reporter said, smiling towards the camera. "The pro heroes would rather you stand by than help your fellow humans. We at Starlight News will always bring you pure and raw news. This is Masuko Misuza at the Takoba Beach junkyard. Izuku." Izuku flinched as he tore his focus away from the TV. His mother was looking at him and her face was scrunched up in concern. "I called your name 3 times, she said as she turned the TV off. "Are you okay?" "Why, yeah, just a little tired," Izuku said, wiping the sweat off his forehead. "I think I'll go shower now." "Did you make any food?" "Of course I did," his mother said, and she continued speaking as he walked away. "Are you sure everything is fine, Izuku? You look pale." Izuku paused before taking a deep breath. He turned back to his mom and smiled. "I'm fine, Mom. I promise," Izuku said with a warm smile. "I think I just pushed myself too hard today and I've still got some homework I didn't finish in the afternoon." Silence. "All right," his mother said finally. "I'm glad you're okay. With all these crazies running around, who knows what could have happened. You heard about what happened at Takoba, right? People cannot just take the law into their own hands. That's what the pros are for." "I saw the police cars drive that way," Izuku said, feeling a bit queasy. "It's a good thing they caught those 2 criminals." "Were there 2 of them?" his mother queried. "I didn't see anyone mention that. Usually, that type of stuff only comes out later. I guess something like this would have some leaks." Izuku let out a sigh as his mother explained away her own question. Finally, he was able to peel off and go into the bathroom. He turned on the shower and he undressed as he waited for the shower to heat up. Izuku inspected his face in the mirror, finding his skin to be unnaturally pale. He closed his eyes as he recalled the short scramble between him and the 2 criminals. If those rods hadn't appeared when they did, he would have been. Izuku stumbled over to the toilet before puking right in the bowl. His skin crawled and his head throbbed as the reality of the situation settled on him. He could have died. He was alive by mere happenstance. If Crank had fired a bit more to the right, then Izuku would have bled out in the heart of a junkyard with nothing to his name. No lives saved, no children inspired, just nothing. That caused another bout of puking. It went on until he was dry heaving, and it was only then that Izuku saw the room was filled with steam from the shower. He went to the sink to rinse his mouth and he frowned as he saw blood leaking from his nose. He wiped it away before hopping into the shower. The biting heat of the water helped to calm him down, and by the time he was out of the shower he felt a lot calmer. He dressed quickly and finished off the last of his homework before opening his bag. He took out the metal rods and he marveled at them. One had a blunt end while the other ended in a dastardly sharp point. These had come from his skin. There was no blemish on either of them, even the one that had deflected a bullet. Interestingly, they were warm to the touch, almost as if they had their own source of heat. Could it be? There was only one way to find out. Izuku channeled his chakra into one of the rods and he blinked as he realized that the rods weren't rejecting his chakra. He pulled the chakra he had put in the rod out, and to his surprise it crumbled away to dust. Cool, Izuku breathed as the dust blew across his room and then dissipated in barely visible sparks of blue. He did the same to the other rod, which left him with neither of the weapons he had used against Crank and Gear. That was good. A sharpened rod would have definitely not been the sort of thing to keep with you, at home or elsewhere. Izuku tried to summon another rod, but he sighed as nothing happened. It reminded him of his discovery of water walking and surface sticking, which Hiruzen alluded to being exercised for gaining control of one's chakra. Somehow, he had to reverse engineer the rods. They were too useful for him to simply ignore, and what if they popped out if he got startled by a cat or something in public? That would be an awful look. Izuku got ready for bed, and before he slept he saw that TBV was trending. It probably wasn't important. Izuku fell asleep almost instantly, the day's events catching up with him. It was all buried and gone, now though. He probably wouldn't have to worry about the incident for the rest of his life. The next morning Izuku was slightly surprised to see the Takoba incident still being talked about. It was a slow news day. That's what he told himself to keep himself calm. He kept calm as radio show hosts talked about a hooded man with a shining white mask, as well as mentioning Gear and Crank by name. It was a slow news day. Izuku had made it to his class. He was confident that the thing would blow over by lunch. It's not like what he had done had been spectacular by any stretch. He would just be the flavor of the morning before fading into blissful. "Did you see the video?" shouted one of his classmates. The TBV deflected a bullet. "Do you know what kind of reflexes you need for that?" "Ignorance. Deflecting a bullet. That was decent at best." What was cool was how TBV just appeared like a looming shadow. Those guys looked so scared. TBV. Takoba Beach Vigilante. How did Nara know the specifics though? His name isn't TBV. That's what the feds call him. You heard the video. He wants to be called the White Mask. Video. What was going on? Izuku scanned his class to see everyone in his class engaged in conversation, and sure enough, they were all talking about the Takoba Beach Vigilante, or, in simpler terms, him. He got shot like 4 times and then just faded away. That's an amazing quirk. It was a slow news day. That's not his quirk. He fired these weird objects from his hands and was glowing purple. That is definitely his quirk. Did you see that Crank guy after he got hit with one? He could barely move. This was really bad. I think the best part about the White Mask is his attitude. said Amy dreamily, a girl who looked down on Izuku and quite a few others. He's so dreamy. I'm glad I found the video on that Sumire chick's website. Izuku froze as he fully processed Ami's words. Where's the video? Izuku said to Amy, surprising himself and the others with the urgency in his voice. Is this from the Takoba Beach Vigilante? Wow, Midoriya. You said all that without stuttering, said one of Ami's friends, her tone mocking. I guess spending some time in that ruin did you some good. There were a few chuckles here and there, but Izuku could not care less about that at the moment. Amy realized that her friend's jibe wouldn't chase him off and she scoffed before answering, it's trending #1 everywhere. I thought a nerd like you would have known all about this, but I guess it's way above your pay grade. Besides, his name isn't the TBV or whatever. Izuku ignored the laughs from the rest of his class as he got out his phone. Sure enough, after searching Sumire's name, he was led directly to a website with a purple design and an article at the very top. It was the headline that made him freeze. Exclusive footage of the Takoba Beach Vigilante in action. Izuku clicked on the article and played the video. He frowned as he saw the whole encounter right from the perspective of Sumire. Izuku was dead certain there had been no cameras, so how? Her eyes. The lack of blinking. Sumire's eyes could record whatever she saw. That explained how everyone knew intimate deals of what was supposed to be an intimate conversation. The video ended with him running away before it switched to a video of Sumire speaking to the camera. The white mask saved my life and I could not stand the slander that was in the press, Sumire said, and her eyes weren't red anymore. They were now just a normal black. I am Sumire Yutsusu, and as an investigative journalist, it is my prerogative to tell the public the truth. Sumire said, her passionate tone doing the opposite of calming Izuku down while the others around him were taken by Sumire's fire and fury. No one is safe. Even the white mask will be brought out of the shadows and into the light. As you saw, he was a bit unsure of his name, so I thought we could help him. There's a poll at the bottom of the page. Subscribe for more content. The video went black. Out of slightly morbid curiosity, Izuku scrolled down and he eyed the options. Admittedly, there were quite a few good ones, but one stuck out to him. Cage. That was probably because of the whole shadows reference. It had a nice ring to it, he had to admit. Maybe he could use it the next time he saved someone. The next time. Where did you voted for Cage too, Deku? Kachan's voice said as he appeared from nowhere. Let's see if that woman's website allows changes. If you thought it was good, then it's definitely bad. Clearly, Kachan had gotten over his guilt at the scavenger hunt situation. There was a chorus of laughs that echoed Kachan's statement, and despite it all, Izuku felt a needle of frustration settle deep within him. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. OC Corner. Kenshiki Chaka, Crank Quirk, Detector. Can detect when a quirk is being used. Cannot identify which quirk it is. Notes. A distorted depth perception and heterochromia is a side effect of this quirk. Kinkin Fukumigo, Gear, Quirk, Muffle. He can contain the sounds made within a certain area. He can control the area of effect, intensity, but not the time limit. Notes. It is very exhausting and novice users cannot move around when using it. A shrill voice is a particularly odd side effect of this quirk. Sumire Yutsusu, Quirk, Video Camera. She can record anything her eyes see. The video can then be uploaded onto a hard drive made out of a special crystal that is attuned to the signals the recording process emits. Notes. Sumire never has to blink, a very convenient side effect thanks to her quirk. Her eyes glow red when her quirk is active. The end of the school day could not have come sooner for Izuku. The talk of him, well actually the Takoba Beach Vigilante, dominated conversation not just in his class, but even in their school. One of their teachers had even mentioned rewatching the fight multiple times since last night. In short, people liked the Takoba Beach Vigilante a lot. Or as the poll had decided to name him, Cage. The fervor and excitement weren't limited to just his school either. All day long, tons of posts and videos spread throughout the internet. Speculation of who Cage could be, what his quirks were, and even a few posts about how handsome he was. Izuku hadn't even shown anyone his face. Now that he was alone at home though, he could admit it to himself. He liked the attention. He really did. People were happy that he had intervened and saved Sumire. They were amazed at the skills he had displayed the last night. Izuku, inspiration of the masses. Well, technically it was Cage who was the inspiration. Izuku wanted to inspire and protect and amaze others, the same way All Might had for decades. To get such a positive reaction, even if people didn't know it was Izuku behind the mask, made him very happy. It wasn't all sunshine and roses, though. Izuku had gone down to Takoba Beach just to scout it out, and apparently, quite a few people had the same idea. They were people posing on top of the metal cabinet he had appeared on. Others crouched in front of the bullet-ridden car that his clone had stood in front of. Izuku wasn't sure when it would end, but what it meant was that he definitely couldn't practice at Takoba anymore. If it became a popular hangout, then it was inevitable that he would run into someone he knew. The other problem was on the other end of the spectrum. Cage had a lot of new fans, but he also had a lot of haters. Izuku knew that animosity from some people was part and parcel of the game, but it was doubly so when you were a vigilante. The few pro-heroes from around Musudafu had strongly condemned Izuku's actions. The most prominent of these being Kamui Woods, who was a shoo-in for a top 10 spot with his current trajectory. That condemnation from pro-heroes was definitely enough to sway people to the other side. Many called for his arrest, called him a lawless vagrant and all sorts of stuff. It hurt a bit more than Izuku was willing to admit. He would not let it get him down, though. Izuku would scour Musudafu for a new training spot until the beach cleared up again. He decided to use the rest of today to catch up and maybe go a bit ahead in his classwork. Izuku felt that he had made it far enough with the Academy 3. The only one that he needed to use instinctively was the substitution. The clone and transformation were great as is, and in truth, there was not a lot more mileage he could get out of them. Maybe he'd think of something later. Instead, he would focus on working out the mechanics of enhancement before starting the body flicker and trying to master the substitution. It took a bit too long for him to use the latter, so he had to shave the activation time down as much as possible as soon as possible. Finally, Izuku would try to figure out how to conjure those metal rods again. He had been a bit rash in getting rid of them, and he'd been unable to make them ever since. The scroll made no mention of object creation from pure chakra, so he was well and truly stumped. It was just something he would have to figure out. Izuku's computer let out a chime signifying an email. He went to his inbox and he freaked out as who the email was from. It took him 10 minutes to open the email. He didn't have to worry. It was just a confirmation of his application. His results were good enough to get into the testing phase despite his supposed lack of a quirk. It probably helped that the question about quirks only came after the candidates for the exam had been chosen. Izuku wasn't entirely sure what he was meant to say about his chakra. He could not keep it a secret forever. Somehow, he'd slip up and the fallout would probably be immense. It wouldn't take much time to figure out that his chakra wasn't a quirk, and then he would have to tell them the truth. That a magical fruit from a magical tree gave him magical powers. This was without mentioning the giant symbols that had appeared in the sky. The scroll had mentioned something about using symbols to perform specialized tasks, but Izuku barely understood a lick of the mentioned theories. It was obviously near the bottom of the scroll for a reason. Turning back to the email, Izuku was about to send a confirmation when he saw that it wasn't necessary to reply. He tried to go back to his work, and to his credit he was about 60% done when he had to put his pen down. He was filled with a nervous energy that he needed to expel somehow. It was still far too early to go to Takoba Beach, but maybe there was somewhere else he could go. Izuku remembered that there were a fair number of abandoned properties scattered across Musudafu. He needed to find one that was relatively private and had enough stuff lying around for him to practice on. He found 3 locations that were spread rather far apart, but he wouldn't mind getting some exercise in. In fact, Izuku decided to pass by the gym as well, a prospect that he would have not taken on months ago. Izuku could admit to himself that he did chase the feeling of satisfaction a good workout provided. His body still hurt after each and every session, but it was fine because he knew that it was for a good cause. Plus, he could now sprint up the stairs to his flat without being out of breath anymore. That was a big deal as far as he was concerned. How had the original architects decided to just not put in elevators? He lived on the 7th floor. Maybe it was best if he didn't reopen old wounds. Izuku changed into his exercise gear and hoodie. He packed a bag with a change of clothes as well as the scroll. He was about to leave when he caught sight of the mask. Cage's mask. Well, sort of. He had made sure that his transformation had altered the decal and general design of the mask. If he hadn't, Izuku would probably be holed up in some juvenile holding center by now or something. Izuku decided to take it with him, just in case he needed it. Maybe some lady would need him to rescue a cat from a tree. He could climb trees with the best of them now after all. Or maybe he'd get another shot at saving someone from dangerous criminals. What was the old saying? Better to have and not need, and so on. Who am I kidding? I definitely want another run. How hard could it be to help someone in need? As it turned out, it was actually very hard to help someone out in need, and that was for one reason and one reason only. Heroes. Pro heroes were ridiculously good at finding and solving situations before Izuku could even get there, let alone help. To be fair, it was daytime, and that meant that crime wasn't exactly booming. The bigger factor was all the normal heroes as well as All Might on top of that. Not even the craziest of villains would want to tempt fate and end up on the business end of a Texas smash. Recently, there had been fewer sightings of All Might going out and about, and yet he still quelled any disasters at an inhuman pace. Izuku imagined it was actually scarier this way for the criminals. Before, it had been relatively easy to earmark All Might's position, and the criminals just had to operate as far away from that point as possible. Now though, All Might could and did randomly appear out of nowhere. A derailing train in the north. All Might was there. He'd make sure everyone was alright before disappearing into thin air, only to stop a hostage situation in South mere minutes later. It was a masterstroke. Unfortunately, All Might was just one man and stuff did slip through the cracks, but that was where the rest of the heroes came in. All Might probably handled 65% of the major incidents in a day, as well as a sizable chunk of the minor ones. He also primarily worked in the daytime. All Might did have many successful night missions, you see his belt, but his skill set lent itself to being more useful during the day. More subtle approaches were needed at night. Heroes like Endeavor and All Might would draw a lot of unwanted attention at night. Plus, it probably kept everyone's morale up to see their beloved number one during the day. It was with that in mind that Izuku decided to exercise at the gym until the sun went down. He had been beaten to an incident for the 11th time that day. The worst part was that 2 of them had been cats stuck in trees. He could have and would have done them a lot quicker than the sidekicks that were assigned to them. Izuku bit down his annoyance as he arrived at his gym. He tapped his card at the entry gate and the automatic door unlocked, allowing him inside. Kendo gym and martial arts was one of the very best in the Musudafu area, in his experience as well, according to the rave reviews online. It was enormous and had superb facilities, but the trainers were also extremely patient. He could only afford to hear because of the interview money. His first day had been terribly awkward. Izuku still felt embarrassed at having to be taught how to use a ton of machines by a girl around his age. He had all but burnt the memory out of his mind except for how to use the machines. The girl's incredulity at him not knowing how to use even some of the more basic machines still stayed with all these months later. The gym was on the bottom floor and the dojo was on the floor above. Izuku had seen the girl walk about in a GI from afar, so he figured she had to be one of the dojo students. Another good reason to not sign up for the dojo. Izuku shook the vestiges of embarrassment away as he loaded up a machine. The familiar burn and strain were like an old friend. Izuku finished his repetitions before heading for the indoor running track. Decathlon competitors, or decathletes, had a holistic approach to exercise. They could not be too bulky or they would not be able to jump as high. They could not be too skinny or they would be too weak for the strength-based events, and so forth. Izuku tried to mirror this as best he could do. There was some stuff he could not do even in this gym, but the trainers had been more than helpful in finding suitable alternatives. The track was occupied by others as well. So, Izuku took a lane of his own as he went through sprinting drills. By the time Izuku finished those along with a few agility and flexibility-focused exercises, it was already late evening. Finally, Izuku felt pretty tired, but he had long since adapted to working through fatigue. Izuku took a quick shower before changing into the spare clothes he had brought along. His mask was at the very top, but for now, he wouldn't really need it. He was just looking for a new training spot after all. He knew of at least 3 abandoned properties around Musudafu thanks to the internet, but he hadn't checked them out before. It was only about 7:30, so the streets were packed. It was also a Friday night, so restaurants, shops, malls, bars and stadiums were jam-packed. This worked to his favor and no one really bothered Izuku as he made his way to his first destination. It was an abandoned apartment building and Izuku did not quite remember the reason for it standing empty. Something to do with noise complaints and air pollution from the factories. He left the noises and lights of the leisure section of the city, moving to a residential industrial sector. There was far less activity here, and so Izuku paid more attention to his surroundings. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of music. It was unlikely that he was being followed, but a little caution could go a long way. After a few minutes of walking past empty buildings and factories, he realized that he was just being paranoid. The music he had heard was only getting louder, but he ignored it for the time being. It was a Friday after all. Izuku checked the street names as he went along, marking them off before he finally arrived at his destination. So this was where the music was coming from. Great. Danzo, is that you? You're kinda early, man, a drunk man said, holding a bottle in his hand, his voice just a little slurred. Are your drinks in the bag? That's smart. I'd never think an all-white bag would have booze in it. You know, I once met him. Mall sight. He's huge, like at least this big, and Izuku chose not to correct the man's mistake. The gates that surrounded the apartment were wide open and at least 100 people were mingling in the parking lot. Music blared from large speakers that someone had set up, and there had to have been at least 40 cars. There were even a few fires that had been started in barrels. Is there a party like this every night? Izuku asked the drunk man who had been rambling on the entire time. Of course, he had to find a mumbling drunk. The mumbling was very irritating. Izuku did not sense the irony in that thought at all. None whatsoever. Of course there is. Musudafu never sleeps. The man slurred. Come on, Hanzo. You are always here. Don't tell me you're on that stuff again. You better share. I'm not. Izuku began but stopped. He had to leave. Apparently, this was a popular partying spot, which was the exact opposite of what Izuku needed. He turned the drunk guy back towards the party and he ignored the lingering smell of alcohol and other such stuff. Outdoor parties were gross. So, the apartment building was a bust. It wasn't all bad. The general area around it was still too populated, and if it was used as a hangout at night, then chances were it was also frequented during the day. After all, there was no trash like at Takoba to repel people away. That meant Izuku needed to find somewhere that wouldn't lend itself to daily parties. Thankfully, he knew just the place. This is getting ridiculous. The second property Izuku had scoped out had also turned out to be a bust. It sucked because it would have been perfect. It was a large secluded factory with high brick walls for added privacy. There was leftover equipment that would have been perfect for testing jutsu on, as well as vast amounts of space. Izuku had been ready to scale the wall when he saw the sign on display. It was the badge of Kamui Woods' hero agency. If whoever owned the lot could afford to have Kamui Woods on a private retainer, then it definitely wasn't a good idea for Izuku to entertain the idea of training there. Especially with how testy Kamui Woods had been in the media as of late. So as the clock struck 9, Izuku walked through the night to his final destination. It was a mall that was owned by a near-defunct real estate group. The mall and the blocks around it were also owned by that group. Apparently, the last surviving scraps of the real estate group were holding onto these buildings like a lifeline. They were all currently boarded up and empty, so Izuku could only assume they were holding out for a buyer. Izuku was sure a buyer would come soon because the mall was within a stone's throw of Ua. The prices for rent near Ua were staggering, but it was well worth it because it was one of the safest places in all of Japan, let alone Musudafu. When Izuku came to the mall itself, he was admittedly impressed. It spread out far and wide across multiple blocks. All the doors and entryway were boarded up, leaving no way in for the average person. Izuku was not average. He walked up the wall using his surface sticking. A few months ago, it had been murder on his core to walk up this way. The first time he had tried it, his upper half had fallen back to the ground. He had almost busted his head open on the ground. Now though, thanks to his exercise, he was strong enough to walk up a wall as if it were the ground. He had to walk the way to the top floor because none of the windows could be opened from the outside. When he made it, the frustration from the adventures. The top floor was a rooftop garden. The garden spanned the entirety of the mall's roof, and it would not be an exaggeration to call it a park instead of a garden. There were plenty of tables, chair, pot plants and so on, but more importantly, there was open space. It would give him enough space to start practicing using those rods he had made. Well, that would only happen if he ever figured out how to make those rods again. As things were, Izuku was stumped. They had appeared in a crisis moment, and he wasn't crazy enough to take a chance on it happening again. He had rewatched the video of the fight multiple times over, and he just did not get it. At the moment, it had felt like his body had acted on its own and surpassed his normal limitations. It was like those stories of women being able to lift fallen cupboards or cars off of their children. What people were not told was that often these women damaged their bodies extensively in pulling off these feats. The body had self-imposed limitations on how much effort one could exert. It was through intense exercise that someone broke through those limitations and pushed the bar further. So, it was possible that Izuku's chakra acted similarly. Perhaps, for whatever reason, he could not recreate those rods. It could be a power issue, lack of control, or anything else really. Izuku was certain that he'd crack the code eventually. For now, though, he had done enough scouting. He would come back tomorrow so he could start working on the enhancement technique. As it was, Izuku had zero firepower. The rods would have been useful, but until he figured that out he had to find an alternative. He kicked a chair leg that had rolled near him out of frustration. "Maybe I could use this," Izuku said, not entirely joking. It was getting pretty late, and having a weapon, even if it was a chair leg, would be better than absolutely nothing. The sound of dogs barking in the distance made his mind up for him. He picked up the chair leg and it was surprisingly sturdy. It would probably suck to be on the wrong side of it. Izuku picked up his bag and improvised weapon before going back over the edge. He undercooked his chakra just enough to allow him to slide down to the ground. The streets were dark with the only light coming from intermittent street lamps. To keep his mind busy, Izuku toyed with chair leg he'd taken along with him. He imagined himself beating away imaginary foes at every turn. If someone had seen him, he'd have looked crazy, but as it was he was all alone. After about 15 minutes, Izuku had made it back to proper civilization. The night was still going strong for a lot of people. It was nothing new. Friday nights were often the liveliest of times along with Saturdays. At this time of the night, there was no more public transport, so Izuku had to walk back on the busy main roads. The problem was there were even more people out now than there had been earlier in the evening. His mother had sent him a few messages already, which made him begin to get annoyed at the crowded walkways. There was a shortcut that went past the kendo gym that would allow him to get home a few minutes quicker. Izuku was certain that the gym and the other businesses on that route were probably closed. Normally, that would be a touch unsettling, however, with his mother bombarding his phone with messages, it was a godsend. Izuku peeled off into the alleyways, going further away from the hubbub of the crowds. He had abandoned his weapon when he had reached the main walkways, and now he felt a bit foolish about the whole thing. He was about to turn the corner into the street of the gym when he heard raised voices. The sound of shuffling drew his attention and Izuku slowed to a halt before peeking around the corner. He nearly groaned when he saw a girl with orange hair surrounded by two men and one woman. The girl stood at the main entrance to the gym and there was a parked car nearby with its headlights off. There was a fourth person, a woman, sitting behind the steering wheel. "We won't ask again, girlie," said the woman and the apparent leader. "We know you lock the gym up on Fridays and we know you guys keep some valuable stuff in there. We know all about your alarm system too. Just unlock the door and things won't have to get messy." Izuku heard enough. He reached into his bag and he prepared a quick plan as his fingers closed on the cool ceramic of his mask. He would not have time to waste. He could not make the same mistakes as he had at Takoba. His eyes scanned the alleyway for stuff he could use and a rough plan formed in his mind. Time to be a hero. Itsuka did not have the time to deal with this. She'd gotten her confirmation from Ua that very day and she had been so pumped she had trained extra hard. She could afford it. Tomorrow was the weekend and that meant she could train for even longer. And yet, here she was getting robbed in front of her parents' gym. Like hell. Itsuka enlarged her fists as she dropped into a stance. One of the men took a small step to the front of the pack and the driver began to climb out of the car. Okay, 4-on-1 was not that bad. The camera's rolling. "Let's do this thing already," Itsuka said as she began hopping from foot to foot. "I think I left my stove on, so we need to speed things up." She couldn't even cook. Not really. A little taunting never hurt anyone. That was what her fists were for. Despite the taunt, however, none of them moved an inch. Itsuka was nervous until the man at the front took another step forward. "Look over here, Carrot Top." Itsuka met his gaze on reflex and she felt her muscles lock as she stared into his eyes. They were a bright pink and she felt embarrassed at falling for his quirk so easily. "Thanks for that, Nirami," the leader said, and as she walked forward her nails began to lengthen until they were 10-inch long spikes. "We're gonna need you in the car, Kaihi," said the woman before turning to Itsuka. "You better pray to your gods. This is gonna get ugly if you don't unlock this store right now." "Give me my bat, Kaihi," said the man closest to the car. "This girl looks tough. She may need some preparation." "Anything else, masters?" Kaihi said before handing the bat to her partner. "I'm not your servant, Heiken." Keep your bat on you at all times. Itsuka felt her worry grow as she saw Kaihi and Heiken chat back and forth. If they were so casual whilst in active crime scene, then this definitely wasn't their first time stepping between the ropes. The only saving grace was that the camera coupled with the street lights would capture their faces clearly. The lights were above them and it allowed her to see their facial expressions despite the time of the day. It was also thanks to the light that she was able to see a large shadow form on the ground. The others noticed it too, and Heiken was the one to spot where it came from. Up there on the roof. What the hell is he holding? Before any of the criminals could move, a large trash can sailed through the air and slammed on the windshield of the car. The result was a loud crunch as it shattered into pieces. The alarm of the car blared through the night air. Someone would definitely have heard both the crash and the alarm. The airbags in the car activated and Itsuka almost felt bad for Kaihi. The woman was not strapped in and so the airbag slammed into with full force, putting her out of commission. The lid of the trash can fell in between Itsuka and the man, keeping her paralyzed. She was freed from her invisible bonds and she sidestepped the leader before delivering a thumping blow to the man's chest. He flew through the air before slamming into the side of the car. Itsuka was vaguely aware of her savior jumping off the roof, but she ignored that as she quickly disarmed the man and laid him out in short order. She put a bit extra in the uppercut and the man fell like a bag of potatoes. Luckily for him, her quirk had been deactivated, so he'd just have a sore jaw for a few days. Who the hell are you? She turned back to see the leader squaring off with Itsuka's apparent savior. The hooded figure was roughly 6 feet tall and he nimbly dodged all the attacks. The leader leapt forward with a slash of her claws, but the hooded figure was replaced by the trash can from before. The woman's claws bit into the crumpled trash can, spilling trash into the street. "Give me the bat!" shouted the hooded man, and Itsuka froze as she saw the gleaming white mask with blue decal. Before she could, though, the man jumped off the car and wrapped himself around a lamp post with just his leg. The leader had gone for broke in her failed attack and she had cut into the bonnet of the criminal's car with her claws. The criminal had been overeager and could not escape immediately. Now. The urgency in the man's disembodied voice sparked Itsuka into action. Itsuka ran to the bat before she threw it to the man. It was a rather wild throw, but somehow he snatched it out the air with just a finger while still wrapped around the pole. He slid down the pole by his leg with a casual grace. He reached the ground and rose with both hands holding onto the bat. Cool. The man used the bat with no technique whatsoever, but he didn't need to have technique. The leader seemed exhausted from chasing the man around and her claws had decreased in length by more than half. She was tired. The man sprung into action as he used the bat to slap aside a sluggish slash. He went down to his knees before using the bat to take out the woman's legs. The woman hit the ground hard and she tried to rise. A foot on her chest stopped that. The man pointed the bat at the woman's face. A silent warning of what would happen if she did anything. The man turned to Itsuka, his mask bathed in the light of the street lamp. "Are you okay? Was she okay? Are you okay? Your knees should be shot. You just jumped off a building. That doesn't apply to me." Mysterious. "What's your name, young girl?" the man said as he pointed the bat at her. Young girl. How old was this guy? He sounded like her grandpa, but he couldn't be that old judging by his build. Itsuka Kendo. She gave up freely. "What's your name?" "I mean your hero name." "You can call me Cage." It was a bit simple, but it definitely suited his aesthetic. "Have you called for backup from other heroes? What agency has the mighty Cage working for them?" Itsuka asked, and she frowned when she saw the man's body language warp from very confident to unsure. Funny story about that. The man's disembodied voice was still able to convey the awkwardness and embarrassment in his tone. Itsuka had a feeling that it wasn't really all that funny. She was not nervous per se. The man had just saved her after all. However, he seemed rattled by her mentioning other heroes. Naturally, she was suspicious. Oh really? Lacquered chain prison. A spray of wooden tentacles suddenly flew at both Itsuka and Cage. Itsuka was caught, but Cage managed to escape by somehow swapping places with Heiken. She struggled against her bonds as Kamui Woods appeared on his from the shadows. What the hell was this? It was so tight she couldn't even activate her quirk. Let her go, Cage said to Kamui as he gestured to the criminal scattered on the ground. She's just a kid. These guys are your criminals. The tentacles wrapped around Itsuka loosened immediately at those words. There were still deep and red marks on her skin and she rubbed at them as Cage spoke again. You usually work alone on your night patrols so you have no backup. If you're on your own then that means you have just two options, Cage said looking at Kamui. You could either chase after me and arrest me or you could arrest the 4 criminals who attacked an innocent girl outside her family's business. The choice is yours. Itsuka watched as Cage ran off without waiting for a reply. A vigilante, huh? She wondered if all vigilantes were as cool as Cage. I'm a huge fan by the way. And as dorky too. This happened at your gym. I'm glad you left before getting mixed up in all of this. He should have expected this. He really should have learnt from the last time and yet here he was having an internal breakdown in front of the TV. All of the news channels were speaking about the incident outside the kendo gym. Starlight News, the one he was watching now, had been constantly replaying footage of the fight since well before sunrise. The video was taken from a security cam and it always started right around the time Itsuka's hands got bigger. It was an interesting quirk. It seemed like a localized gigantification and it probably gave her one hell of a power boost. The punches she delivered looked devastating. Then, for at least the 7th time that weekend, Izuku watched as he intervened and helped Itsuka. Around the time of his 3rd rewatch, he had noticed how Itsuka seemed to have a fluid and learned fighting style. Itsuka's skill only became more obvious the more he focused on her. She was strong enough to take care of herself even without having to use her quirk. Did she learn all this from the dojo? He recognized her as the girl who had shown him the ropes on his first day at the gym. The penny had only dropped for him after she told him her name. Images of her wearing a training GI and walking around the gym had formed in his mind. All in all, Itsuka's skill was a great endorsement for the dojo. Most heroes had support items to help their fighting style. The powerhouses like All Might and Endeavor didn't really need any items, but Izuku had many notes about some of the more impressive items. Itsuka on the other hand seemed to be rather advanced for her age. She did not need a support item or even her quirk to be effective. She already knew martial arts and was confident enough in her own strength to take on 4 people at once. He was pulled away from his thoughts as it got to the part of the video where Kamui got the drop on them. It had been rather fortunate that he had been able to avoid the wooden snares. Itsuka had been caught, which was unfortunate, but he knew she'd be fine. She wasn't the one breaking the law, after all. That bad been all him. Izuku had used substitution on one of the criminals and to his delight it had actually worked. Being able to use substitution on other people could make for some great combos. The thing was Izuku still had just about 0 firepower. He was untrained in hand-to-hand combat. Despite how easy it had looked on the video, avoiding the criminal's attacks had been very difficult. He was only able to go on the offensive when he had gotten the bat from Itsuka. Furthermore, his ranged attacks currently consisted of throwing a full trash can. It looked cool in the video, but carrying that bin up the wall had been decided uncool. The solution was clear as day. He had to start learning elemental chakra control. The scroll had a lot of techniques for all 5 elements. It was a treasure trove of information. The scroll was obviously meant to be used by an entire clan, and so Izuku knew that Hiruzen added so much stuff to cover as many bases as possible. Izuku originally planned to only work on the enhancement technique, which would hopefully lead to a quick segue into the body flicker. From there, he had planned to begin his elemental training. However, he was once again keenly aware of his limitations. Itsuka could probably have handled at least 3 of those criminals from last night on her own. Izuku had so much potential at his fingertips, and he wasn't tapping into it because he was scared. His quirk was wildly different from any other that was on the record. If what his full capabilities spread around, then Izuku could kiss his current life goodbye. Much like the participants at the UA sports festivals, once you stepped into the limelight, you were there to stay. Kamui, for example, had trapped everyone at the start of his obstacle race in his first year. It was unsurprising that he had gotten a grant to start his agency right out the gate. Izuku just had to be prepared to deal with the ramifications of his power. As a future hero, it was his duty to give it his all in everything he did. He couldn't choose to not learn something because he was scared of the blowback. There would be no room for fear if he wanted to pass the UA exam, and there was certainly no room for fear if he wanted to be the next number 1. It was with that mantra in mind that Izuku realized his training schedule was about to get busier. The entrance exams were in 6 months. He had 6 months to make himself worthy of a spot in UA. There would be people like Kachan and Itsuka all fighting for spots. He had no choice but to catch up to them, or he'd be left behind for good now. Breaking news here at Starlight News, said the news anchor. A man who a fox head, our head reporter is outside Kendo gym and martial arts. The site of an attempted robbery that was thwarted by the owner's daughter and the Takoba Beach vigilante. What have you got for us? What could they have now? His mother said as the news cut to the outside of the gym. This channel is a bit too chaotic for me, but they do have the most scoops. Izuku hummed his agreement as the Starlight reporter began to speak. Izuku recognized him as the reporter who had interrogated Kamui Woods after Izuku's debut as Cage. What was his name again? Hello, Japan. My name is Masukomi Souza, said the man with practiced ease. We are outside the site of yet another incident involving the Takoba Beach vigilante. As you would have seen, the man calling himself Cage rescued a young girl from 4 criminals with a long list of crimes to their name. The girl is inside, but more importantly, we have personally confirmed that Kamui Woods is here too, Masukomi said before his tone became derisory. The rising hero has been under fire for his failure to respond to the Takoba Beach incident. Last night we had another incident that the pros failed to find out about. I understand that our pros cannot be everywhere and they do not know everything, Masukomi said, a burst of passion in his voice. That does not excuse what happened last night. Cage the vigilante rescued young Itsuka Kendwan. What was his reward? He got blindsided by a supposedly honorable hero. To make matters worse, Kamui caught Itsuka in the crossfire of his sneak attack. Izuku felt a general sense of unease at how the incident was being framed. So not only did a brave civilian have to save Itsuka, but one of the people paid to protect this nation's citizens almost hurt an innocent girl. Kamui's agency is funded by government money. Money that comes from the people. With that in mind, there ought to be certain expectations, Masukomi said to the camera. When an unlicensed and unpaid hero is doing more to help than those on the payroll of the people, then difficult questions need to be asked. Masukomi was about to say more, but he switched gears as Kamui walked out of the gym. From what Izuku could see, the gym was open for business, and that lifted his mood. He had been worried that it would stay closed for a few more days. Kamui, I'm here for Starlight News, Masukomi said as he ran over to the pro. Last night, you failed to respond in time to save Itsuka, and you also failed to capture the Takoba Beach vigilante, also known as Cage. Furthermore, there is footage showing you capturing young Itsuka after Cage had already subdued the villains. Kamui seemed annoyed by Masukomi's words, and Izuku understood how that must have felt. Your projected approval ratings have also understandably taken a large hit, Masukomi said with a false neutralization. How do you